There is no national team competition in football that produces more underdog stories than the African Cup of Nations, Afcon. As is often said, no matter how established or world-class you are, when you come to Afcon, you can rest assured that anybody can humble you. The competition is a leveler. Even players from the most obscure and unknown leagues come to Afcon and are able to hold their own against the world's best players. It is perhaps the toughest competition for global superstars to excel in. We have seen many crazy underdog stories at Afcon, but here are 3 truly unforgettable ones. Comoros, the 4th smallest country in Africa, with a population of less than 1 million, had never been to Afcon in their entire history. Their impressive qualification run, in which they got a creditable home draw against 7-time Afcon champions Egypt and 4 points out of 6 against the more favoured Kenya, gave the world a hint of what was possible. Qualifying for the first time in itself was a monumental achievement. Nobody expected them to do anything at the tournament itself, especially after they were drawn in a group against 2 African giants in Morocco and Ghana, both former champions. They were ranked 132nd in the world by FIFA coming into the tournament. In their first game against Gabon, regarded as the least daunting team they had to face in the group, they lost 1-0 after a solid performance. Neutrals instantly liked them, but it looked certain to be early elimination with those 2 opponents coming up. In their second group game, they lost 2-0 to Morocco, but not without drama. Their goalkeeper Salim Ben delivered a man-of-the-match performance, keeping the score at 1-0 until the 88th minute, even saving a penalty before that, in a really tense game that had viewers on the edge of their seats. If the first game did not win all the neutrals, the second game certainly did. Everybody was now part Comorian. They now had to win their final game against Ghana to stand a chance of qualifying as one of the best 3rd-place teams. Ghana themselves had only managed a draw in 2 games after 2 underwhelming performances and were under immense pressure. They too needed a win to be able to advance. Before the game, Comoros suffered a huge blow as Ben Boyna, who had kept the scoreline low versus Morocco with his heroics, got injured. That didn't deter them, however, as they scored within 4 minutes, their first ever Afcon goal. Things started to look brighter not long after as Ghana's Andrea Yu got sent off. Just after the hour mark, they grabbed a second goal. 2-0, and they were now dreaming. But Ghana refused to let the euphoria last for long. 2 minutes later, they pulled one back, and 13 minutes later, they were level. At 2-2 now, Ghana had all the momentum. They, despite being a man down, were pushing for a winner that looked to be inevitably coming. And just when everybody had started to expect the 3rd Ghanaian goal, Comoros did the unthinkable. Ahmed Monye, who had scored the second goal, added the 3rd, which turned out to be the winner. It was the 85th minute. They were now almost there, but had to withstand a barrage of pressure from Ghana. They held on and eventually qualified for the second round. Now it got even more difficult, but they didn't care. They were in the next round. They were to face the host Cameroon, 5-time winners and one of the tournament favourites. Worse, they had to do it without 12 players who had been sidelined due to COVID. That included 2 backup goalkeepers, with starting goalkeeper Ben Boyna still out injured. One of the goalkeepers had actually tested negative on the day of the game, but had to be excluded because CAF's same-day protocol made him ineligible. All protests fell on deaf ears, so Comoros had to face Cameroon with an outfield player, defender Shakir Alader, in goal. 7 minutes into the game, their captain Najim Abdou picked up a red card. By this point, everybody expected a massacre. There was a lot of sympathy for them and what they were about to face. In fact, it seemed as though everyone who wasn't Cameroonian was supporting Comoros that night. In the 29th minute, Cameroon finally scored. Through Kao Toko Ekambi, it had begun. For the next 40 minutes, to everyone's shock, Cameroon could not find a second goal. Alader, the defender who was in goal, was putting in a solid performance, as was the Comoros defense. Eventually, after fighting valiantly, Comoros could not hold them anymore. Cameroon scored again through Vincent Abubakar. By this point, it seemed over, but Comoros had shown a fighting spirit and resilience that was immeasurable. They simply refused to go away. In the 81st minute, they were right back in it. A crazy free kick by Yusuf Mchangama from 30 yards out gave them hope. Cameroon were now the ones under pressure. The final minutes of the game were nervy, with everyone wheeling Comoros towards another goal. They came close, but ultimately lost 2-1. Considering the circumstances and the adversity they had faced, this was an underdog performance and tournament for the ages. They had bowed out with their heads held high. What a team, and what an underdog story. Before 2013, Burkina Faso had been to 8 Afcon tournaments and had failed to win a game at 7 of them. The only previous tournament where they had won a game was in 1998, a tournament they hosted, where they won 2 of their 6 games and finished 4th. Every other tournament had produced a group stage exit, and they had lost a total of 18 games out of 26. In fact, they had never won an Afcon game outside their country in 20 attempts. Even in qualification for the 2013 tournament, they had snatched the ticket at the last minute against Central African Republic with a 96th minute goal by Alain Traoré. Nothing was really expected of this side. Hardly anyone even saw them making it out of their group, which had 2-time champions Nigeria and the reigning champions Zambia. But this side had the aforementioned Alain Traoré of Lorient, Jonathan Pietrapa of Rennes, Charles Kabore of Marseille, and the flamboyant Aristide Banse of Augsburg. Their first game against Nigeria was expected to be a straightforward win for the Super Eagles, and it looked to be heading that way until Burkina Faso found a 94th minute equalizer through Alain Traoré once again. And on the 25th of January 2013, the Burkinabe won their first ever Afcon game outside their country, beating Ethiopia 4-0. They went into the final game top of the table with 4 points, with Zambia and Nigeria on 2 points each, and Ethiopia on 1 point. There was still a lot to play for, but they just needed to avoid defeat against Zambia to qualify for the next round. Despite Zambia's best efforts, the boys from Sankara's nation pulled off a remarkable draw to knock out the reigning champions. Nigeria's 2-0 victory over Ethiopia meant that it was Burkina Faso who emerged leaders of the group. That helped them avoid tournament favorites Ivory Coast in the next round. Instead, they were up against Togo, a far less daunting team. The nervy quarterfinal clash ended 0-0 after 90 minutes, but Jonathan Pietrapa found the goal that took them through in extra time. It was their first ever Afcon knockout victory that did not involve penalties. Now, history beckoned. Things were about to get more difficult as they had to face a strong Ghana team, one of the tournament favorites, who were desperate for Afcon glory. 13 minutes in, Mubarak Wakaso scored from the penalty spot. By halftime, it was still 1-0 in Ghana's favor, and the Burkina boys had 45 minutes to make history for their country. They came back with renewed vigor and almost scored through an Aristide Banse header from a corner. The man was not to be denied not long after. Some smart pressing helped them win back possession in the Ghanaian half, and Banse was one-on-one with the goalkeeper. He made no mistake, slotting it home. Pichopa then picked up a red card for diving in the box. Replays showed that he was actually taken down and should have had a penalty. Despite their protests, the decision stood. The game went on to a nail-biting penalty shootout. In the end, Burkina Faso emerged victorious. The team that had never won an Afcon game outside their country were now in an Afcon final for the first time in their history. They were one game away from the trophy. Once again, as in the groups, they were up against a Mikel Obi-inspired Nigerian team. Pichopa's red card was overturned after an appeal and he was cleared to play. It was the Afcon final, the biggest game in Burkina Faso's history. They did not come into the game as favorites, but everybody was wary. They had earned the right to be playing in Africa's greatest showcase, and they had a lot to give. The final was nervy. Coaches Stephen Keshi of Nigeria and Paul Pot of Burkina Faso seemed to be locked in a chess game. It being a final meant that neither side wanted to give too much away, and both went for a more pragmatic approach than in the previous games. But just before halftime, Nigeria struck. A deflected Victor Moses shot landed perfectly for Sunday Mba, who went on to score one of the best goals in Afcon final history with 2 touches. As it happened in the semi-final, Burkina Faso went into halftime a goal down. They once again needed to come back with renewed vigor to take down Nigeria. In the second half, they pushed hard, committing more men forward and creating a few chances. But they were to be denied by an informed Vincent Enyama, the best African goalkeeper at the time, when Wilfried Sanu thought he had given them an equalizer late in the game. Enyama's outstretched hand thwarted him, and the ball went wide by inches. Soon, the dream was over, and Nigeria emerged champions of Africa. Burkina Faso may have narrowly missed out on the trophy, but what they had done by even going that far was incredible. They had written a story that would be told for generations and made history. What an underdog story. This may be the greatest underdog story in international football history, partly for the enormity of the feat and partly because of the depth of the story. This is the story of the Zambian national team. The story does not even begin in 2012, rather 1993. The Zambian national team were building a special generation of players led by the inimitable Kalusha Bwalya, and were becoming a formidable force on the continent. While on their way to a 1994 World Cup qualifier in Dakar, tragedy struck. Their plane crashed into the Atlantic Ocean off Gabon. It was a major tragedy that claimed the lives of all on board: 18 players, 7 coaches and support staff, and 5 crew members. It remains one of the darkest days in football. The only player who did not die in the crash was Kalusha Bwalya himself, the team's best player, who was to fly in for the game directly from the Netherlands, where he was playing for PSV. Less than a year later, they were in an Afcon final against Nigeria. In those months following the crash, they had built an entirely new team, led by Kalusha, and somehow nearly conquered the continent. It was a team inspired by the death of their colleagues and pushing to honor them in the only way they knew, winning the Afcon trophy they had so wanted. Unfortunately, that did not happen, as they lost 2-1 to Nigeria, widely regarded as the best African team of the 90s. At the next Afcon in South Africa in 1996, they fell short of the goal once again, finishing 4th. As the years passed by, mediocrity inevitably set in. The team exited the next 3 Afcon tournaments at the group stage, winning just 1 game. In 2004, they didn't even qualify. The mediocrity continued. From 1996 until 2010, Zambia failed to play a knockout game at Afcon. They also never qualified for the FIFA World Cup. But something was brewing by the 2010 tournament. They seemed to be building another promising team, but this time less reliant on individual brilliance. The team led by Christopher Katongo shocked the continent when they topped a group with Cameroon and Tunisia. That meant that they got to play their first knockout game since 1996 against old foes Nigeria. This game was a nail-biter that went to penalties, but not without the Zambian team pushing Nigeria all the way, dominating the game for long periods. Unfortunately, they lost out on penalties and fell once again to those opponents. In 2012, still coached by the returning Hervé Renard, they showed that it was not a fluke. The tournament was staged in Gabon and Equatorial Guinea, 19 years after the Zambia national team plane had crashed in Gabon. Their first opponents, Senegal, the team they were on their way to play against in 1993 when the plane crashed. The coincidences were too many to be ignored. Zambia made mincemeat of their opponents in that group, with 2 wins and a draw sending them to the knockouts as group winners. In the quarterfinals, they faced Sudan and dispatched them pretty easily. 3-0 the scoreline, and everybody started to take notice. The team was looking excellent. Still, nobody regarded them as favorites because the tournament still had Ivory Coast, who were overwhelming favorites, and Ghana. In the semi-finals, Zambia faced Ghana. The Ghanaian team were the runners-up at the previous tournament and had looked very strong all tournament. They came into the game with a lot of confidence, and it did not take long for them to impose themselves, winning a penalty in the first half. Gyan Asamoah stepped up to take it, hoping to continue to banish the ghosts of his famous miss at the 2010 World Cup. Zambian goalkeeper Kennedy Umwene dived to his left and saved the penalty. Zambia were still in it. All game, Ghana battered the Zambians, creating chance after chance, but they were thwarted by a formidable Zambian defense and goalkeeper Mwene, who was a wall. And in the 78th minute, the tide turned. Emmanuel Mayuka was the man to do it, sending a shot into the Ghanaian goal to give Zambia the lead. The Ghanaians were stunned. With time running out, they threw everything at the Zambians to get an equalizer, but it was not to be. Zambia held on to make their 3rd Afcon final. This was an outcome that nobody saw coming. Well, except those who were superstitious. None of Zambia's games till this point had been played in Gabon. All had been in Equatorial Guinea. The final, however, was to be played at the Stade d'Agonje in Libreville, Gabon, just a few kilometers from the crash site. The team went to the crash site to pay homage to their fallen heroes, with a promise to make them proud. It looked like Zambia had a date with destiny, but what they were up against was huge. Apart from the emotions that would come with playing in that venue, they also had to deal with the star-studded Ivorian team, who were overwhelming favorites to win the final. Zambia, on paper, were no match for the Ivorians, who paraded Didier Drogba, Kolo and Yaya Toure, Salomon Kalou and Gervinho. The team had reached the final without conceding a goal, beating every single team. Even the most optimistic Zambians knew the enormity of the task ahead. The game began as expected, with Ivory Coast playing with the pressure of favorites and trying to make things happen. Zambia held their own, kept things tight at the back, and played with reasonable caution. By the second half, it was mostly end-to-end stuff, but with Ivory Coast creating far more chances. That eventually led to something just before the 70th minute, as Gervinho won a penalty after being clattered in the box. This seemed to be the moment for Ivory Coast. Everybody knew that if they took the lead, it would probably be over for Zambia. After all, Ivory Coast had still not considered in the tournament. Up stepped Didier Drogba, the man for finals, as everyone held their breaths. And then he skied it. A euphoric Mwene jumped up in excitement and celebrated in front of Drogba with a "can't see us" gesture, which was common amongst the Zambian players. Meanwhile, the distressed Drogba couldn't believe it and seemed to be blaming the scuffed penalty spot as Yaya Toure stepped up to console him. The game had now truly come to life, with tension rising as it entered the final 20 minutes. Nobody wanted to be the first to blink, especially with so little time to find an equalizer, if they conceded. By the end of regulation time, it was 0-0. Extra time came, still no goals, but not due to a lack of trying. Both teams pushed to get that one goal, but it was not to be. Ivory Coast had now gone the entire tournament without conceding a single goal. But Zambia were the first team to keep them from scoring or winning a game in regulation time. And so, it went to penalties. This was where the real drama happened. Both teams scored their first 7 penalties, including goalkeeper Mwene, who scored the 5th penalty to keep Zambia in it. Mwene had actually saved Solbamba's penalty, the 3rd Ivorian kick, but it had to be retaken because it was off his line at the time of the kick. Bamba retook it and scored. The 8th penalty for either side was taken by Kolo Toure. He stepped up, moved a huge distance backwards to the amusement of the crowd, and hit a tame penalty. Mwene saved it. Everybody was stunned. The Zambian team was on the brink of glory. They just had to score theirs. As anticipation grew, Rainford Calabar stepped up, score, and Zambia were champions. He missed. Like Drogba earlier, he skied it. The Ivorians went crazy in jubilation before breathing a sigh of relief. Kolo Toure was on his knees, knowing he had just been let off the hook. Ivory Coast were back in it. Next up, Gervinho. He had looked the most nervous of all the players there. It looked like he really did not want to take a penalty and had been hoping that the shootout would be completed before it got to him. Now, there was no hiding place. He had to take the penalty. Only fullback Jean-Jacques Gosso and goalkeeper Boubacar Barry were left, with everyone once again holding their breaths. Gervinho sent his penalty wide. Advantage Zambia again. For the second time, Ivory Coast were in trouble and Zambia were on the brink of glory. Stopila Sunzu was next for Zambia. As he hit the penalty, he slipped, but the ball stayed low and on target. Boubacar Barry went the wrong way, and glory was here. Zambia were champions of Africa, in the country where their heroes had crashed and died 19 years before, just a few kilometers away from where they were. After the initial euphoria came reflection at what this moment meant for all of them. They all huddled together on their knees and solemnly prayed, emotions overflowing. This was for their heroes. Everything had come full circle, finally. As Captain Christopher Katongo lifted the Afcon trophy, the significance of the achievement became more apparent, and emotions flew all around the world. Everyone was in awe at what they had just witnessed. Nobody could have written a better script. What a story. Sidebar: notice how Ghana are in all the stories.